let's start. Okay, hello, we are here for the subject matter language and culture, and this is my task number one, and this is the interview I have to make to my English teacher. So for this opportunity, we have our teacher, and please tell us your name and what do you do here.
All right, I'm Andrea Munoz, and I'm an EFL teacher and tutor at UNAT as well. Uh, well, I teach at the moment Advanced English 2 and Academic English.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's start with our short interview.
All right.
The first question is, tell me, what do you think about culture?
Well, I would like to cite Lustig and Custer, which are two authors that define culture in a way that I think is the best way to see it. And they say that it is a learned set of shared interpretations about beliefs, values, and norms which affect the behaviors of a relatively large group of people. This means that humans are not born with a culture, they learn the cultural aspects of any society. And that means that they learn to interact with people around them and therefore to communicate with that people. So if you take two children born at the same time but living in different parts of the world, they will learn different cultural aspects, and those cultural aspects will interfere in their communication in their language.
Okay. Thank you very much. So the second one, so tell us, what is the influence of culture in the process of a foreign language process?
Well, like I just said,
Okay.
it is a learned behavior, so they are very close related. I mean, culture is language, is values, is cuisine, is everything around us that's culture, and that comes with the language and how we communicate that in a spoken way, in a written way, with non-verbal communication, with verbal communication. They are very close related one to the other. I mean, it is that relationship is very complex, you can say, because it is complicated. It is very challenging to understand every person's culture and therefore the way they communicate. And we teachers, we language teachers, when we are placed in front of a group of students, each one of those students is a culture itself. We all share some values, some background, but each individual is unique. And so how we communicate with that individual makes a huge difference in learning and teaching a language.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a challenging process as well. So the third one, how do you involve culture in the strategies you use in your English classes? Please give real examples.
Well, that's one of the hardest part. The hardest parts because uh, since it is a learned set of things, your own culture interferes when you are teaching a foreign language. So first thing you need to do as a teacher is to actually get to know the culture of the language you are teaching. So if you are teaching American English, go ahead and learn as much as possible about American culture. If you are teaching British English, then go ahead and learn about British culture. Uh, Both are completely different. They might have some similarities, and the language might have some similarities, but the culture is completely different. So those differences and learning that part is extremely important when you are teaching a foreign language. In a classroom, or in any given lesson, since we are teaching the language, we are also teaching the culture. We should be teaching the culture as well. So, for example, on a class of idioms, which is particularly from each culture, we cannot expect students to translate from Spanish to English idioms that do not exist in the other culture.
Right.
For example, we in Spanish say, okay, hijo de tigre sale pintado, right? You can try and translate it in English, but a literal translation would not be the same as finding the correct idiom for that idea, for that experience in the culture. So in English, you would say, okay, like father, like son.
Okay.
See, no animals involved there, but it's the same idea. Or when it's raining, here, when it is raining very hard in Spanish, how do you say? Está lloviendo a cántaros.
Exactly.
If you try to translate that in English, people there is not going to understand you. So you have to find the correct idiom. Okay, it's
Like
raining cats and dogs. And you say, wait a minute. ¿Cómo así que llueve perros y gatos? What's that? So you cannot translate when you are teaching the language. You cannot literally translate to your own language because then culturally it wouldn't make sense.
Okay.
So that's those are some of the examples, very clear examples on how language, our native language, might interfere with the foreign language, and that's because of a culture. Or, for example, we talk about when we are talking about food, we are teaching food. In our Colombian culture, we have a very good breakfast, a huge lunch, and a very light dinner. That's mostly what we do. But in the American culture, they do not have a good lunch. They have a very light lunch, almost like a snack. And then they have a big dinner. So if we are teaching our students about food, let's talk about those differences in cuisine, in schedules, in the way they see food and the way we see food. We take an hour, 2 hours break to have lunch. They take 15, 20 minutes to have lunch because that's not an important meal. The important meal is dinner.
Okay.
So those differences in the classroom are very important when we are teaching the language. Not only the vocabulary that comes with it, but what you can find behind that vocabulary and all those grammar structures, which are not really as important as how can we communicate with that people over there? How can we transmit our ideas without interfering with our culture?
Okay, thinking in what you have told me, in that part, the same happens when we are trying to tell a joke. It's different.
Exactly, that they don't understand our jokes because they do not know our culture, and we do not understand their jokes because we don't understand their culture. That is why when you are watching a movie, for example, if you know the language, you laughed, and everybody looks at you like, why are you laughing at? And it's because you understand the whole context and the whole culture there. If you don't laugh, that means that you just made a literal translation, and you're like, okay, that's, well, yeah, might be funny, but no, didn't like it because in our culture that it's not as important as in their culture. So yeah, that's a huge difference.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question I have is, what do you consider are the most important elements to succeed in the second language learning?
Well, see, I go with an anthropologist. He Mr. Hall. He came up with a term called proxemics, and it's like the study of space and distance and the way we organize ourselves in a classroom, for example, and how that comes with the culture, the way we stand in front of a person, what is our distance with that person, how do we use our movement, our hands to communicate. And he separates culture into contexts, the high context culture and the low context culture. Now, Colombia, for example, we are a high context culture. We do not respect spaces. We leave our doors open at home, for example, our bedrooms, so mom and dad can enter the room anytime they want. That's high context culture. We hug when we meet our friends, or we kiss, or we touch a lot, and we don't have that space. And when we are learning, we have the same relationship with the teacher. We treat our teacher as a friend, and we are very close to that person. In a low context culture, like most European cultures and American culture, for example, they keep a distance. It is usually an arm length. So when you say hello to a person, you usually take that distance. You do not kiss unless you are extremely good friends. You might shake hands, but that's all. You have a sense of respect for your teachers, in the sense that you use titles for them, like Mr. or Mrs. Or Professor. And in a classroom, that of course is evident in those lectures where you see 50, 100 students just listening to a lecture, keeping the distance. While here in Colombia, I mean, we are very close to each other and trying to touch. So those two contexts in terms of teaching a language, for me, are extremely important in a classroom. For example, in an EFL classroom or an ESL classroom, students need to feel comfortable. They need to feel that, we teachers understand their frustration when they cannot communicate. We need to give them a pat on the back and say, you're doing great. Or, they need to feel that, because we are a high context culture. The low context cultures, for example, Asians, they do not like to be touched. They prefer to work individually. They do not enjoy you saying good job. No, they are doing a job and that's it.
Okay.
So knowing those differences, I think, is very important for an English teacher, especially in English as a second language, because that means that we are in the place where English it's common, and so we might have a multicultural classroom with the students from all over the world. If we were here in Colombia, we would say English as a foreign language. So we just take into account that all of my students are high context culture, so I can treat them the way I treat all my students from Colombia, right? But if I'm in a second language context, I have to see, and that's one of the things I usually do, is to see where are they from, and if they are high context culture or low context culture, to see if I can touch them or not, if I can, if one gesture, it is a good gesture in their culture, or if it is a bad word, or if I'm insulting them, or all those tiny little details that come with culture, how can they affect my teaching with those students?
Okay, it's very interesting. And we have two more questions. Is it important to teach English involving Colombian culture or American culture?
Well, that's a very interesting discussion. There are authors that say that you should not use the mother tongue to teach an English lesson, and some other authors say all the opposite, that you should use the mother tongue to communicate, because then students will feel more comfortable, right? And that is pretty much American and Colombian culture. So how can we blend both cultures? Because in reality, if we are here in Colombia, we cannot separate them. I mean, because we are in a Colombian culture, so of course we are going to have Colombian culture all around, but we need to include American culture into it so that we can blend them and try to find similarities and see how we can work on that. But if we are in a different country, and I have Colombian students, for example, I might or might not use that to my advantage. It really depends on the context. And over here, I would say you definitely need to use both. I mean, there is no way to separate them. You can say, okay, it's an English-only class, and you as a teacher will speak in English all the time, but your students are not going to do the same.
Okay.
They are going to be speaking in Spanish from time to time, and they are going to ask you a question in Spanish, and they are going to gossip with their friends in Spanish, and there is no way you can stop that, because it's part of our culture. I mean, from time to time we need to rest, and from time to time the easiest way to rest is to use our mother tongue. And so we cannot separate that. We cannot say, okay, you cannot use Spanish here, because they are going to find a way to use it anyway.
Okay.
So it is just a matter of how we tell those students, let's try to use just a little Spanish and try to use more English, but we cannot deny them that possibility to speak their language and see if they are understanding or not. Or when we bring into different topics, let's come back to the food, for example. We can create a very nice lesson on food with realia, with fruits and vegetables and elements from the environment. But since they are from Colombia, so they are going to be, Colombian vegetables and Colombian fruits. And believe me, they do not taste the same as the ones you try in other countries, because weather is different, the land is different, the things they use to make it grow, it's different, so the flavor is different. So there we combine. I mean, we are speaking in English, but we have these ingredients that are from Colombia, so there you go, Colombian and American.
Okay.
In tiny little details like that.
Oh.
You see, we have to blend.
It's important to blend, because that's one of the students most questions, more questions at the classroom. For instance, they told me, "Hey, what do you call empanada?"
Exactly, that's empanada. There is no translation
empanada,
for that.
exactly.
This is cultural. It is our food. So we say, okay, tamal. Maybe we can say tamale, because they try to a tamale. But when you try to describe how to prepare a tamale, you're like, okay, you need plantain leaves. Yeah, okay, and what else do you need? And all the ingredients, of course, are going to be from here. If we try to explain that to an American child, he doesn't know what a plantain plant looks like. So
Exactly.
because it's not part of their environment, so of course it's going to be very hard to explain to that little guy that part.
Okay, thank you. So, and the last one, and this is my last question, and what aspects of culture teachers should bear in mind in a classroom? What aspects?
What aspects? Well, non-verbal communication. I mean, I think it's very important to bear in mind that part, because we are teaching, of course, the verbal part, how to say this, how to say that, what's the word for this, what's the word for that. the grammar structure, how we can create a nice sentence, and blah 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 blah. So, but the non-verbal part that comes with culture, I think it's a very important aspect to take into account when we are preparing our lessons. Mainly because it might be because I am very kinesthetic, and so I need to move, and I need to move my hands and my face, and I communicate not only with my voice but also with my body, and so that is, I think, culturally speaking, a very important aspect to consider. That when you are teaching to any group of English language learners, you need to consider how you also communicate with your body. It is that communication reflecting your own culture, or is it reflecting the culture you are teaching? Or is it a blend of both cultures? Or, all those tiny aspects we talk about it before. I think that's one of the most important aspects for me to consider.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your time for this interview. And one last thing, explain us why don't you like to appear on the video?
Well, not really a camera girl. I do not like to see myself on videos. I do not mind speaking at all. You can see that. I mean, I can talk for hours and hours and hours and hours. I don't know, I just don't like it.
It's a cultural aspect.
It's a cultural aspect. It is. We are. See, I didn't grow up with cameras. Like now, boys and girls, like they have cameras in their cell phones, and cameras are everywhere, and they are taking pictures and selfies and things like that. I grew up in a little town with maybe a television when I was 10 years old. So things like that was not like an important thing to consider. When we take pictures, it was just for a moment and bye. But when you are recording, so you see yourself there moving, and I don't like that part. I always struggle appearing on camera. I don't really enjoy seeing myself in the camera. I did have to record myself many times when I was learning English. So that also kind of frustrates me a little bit, because I had to watch myself many times and see what mistakes I was doing, and if I was moving my mouth correctly, or if my face was looking at the camera or was looking somewhere else, or that's cultural too, and it's part of the learning process as well. And well, I think I did my amount of videos for now, so I don't want to be on more videos. But you are starting, so you can be on many videos. Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the reasons.
Okay, thank you very much, teacher.
No problem, anytime.